In this video, I go over a script that will start and stop session hosts in Windows Virtual Desktop Spring Update based on the number of users connected. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Verbose. In this video, I go over a script I created that will start and stop VMs in a host pool. This is similar to a script I created last year that does the same thing, but updated for Windows Virtual Desktop, ARM, or Spring Update. Before that, please subscribe, like, share, and click the bell icon to get alerts on new content. This helps my channel and is greatly appreciated. I'm going to start with an overview of the script and then go into a demo on setting it up. If you're familiar with my first version of the script, you may remember that I had to use an Azure Function to trigger the Azure Automation Runbook. This was a workaround because PowerShell module for the current GA version of the Windows Virtual Desktop required PowerShell 5, so I had to use an Azure Automation Runbook. Azure Automation was limited to a 1-hour recurring schedule, not frequently enough for the script, so I created a function app that would run every 5 minutes and start the runbook. The new az.DesktopVirtualization PowerShell module runs on PowerShell Core, so the entire script can run from the function app. I also use managed identities to give the function app permission to start and stop VMs in the resource group. This made the script much simpler to configure and deploy. Let's start with the logic for the script. The logic has not changed since the last version. Let's go over load balancing. The script was designed for and will only work with depth-first load balancing. Here's why. Odds are if you're trying to dynamically start and stop a VM, there are some cost considerations involved. Breadth-first load balancing spreads sessions evenly across all available hosts. Say you have a session host that will handle 10 connections each. 3 users log in, 1 per server. This is a 10% utilization of each host. It's not very efficient. In the same scenario, depth first will put all 3 connections on one host, along with the next 7 sessions before new connections are directed to the next server. Also, let's say users log off and log on during the day and each host has less than the maximum number of connections. Say 9 users on one, 5 and 4 on the others in this example. New connections are directed to the host with the most connections that has not reached the session maximum. This is a much more efficient way of handling new sessions. The script uses simple math to figure out the number of session hosts that should be running. It starts by finding the number of active session and adds a threshold value to that number. The threshold value is the number of sessions that should be available at all time to satisfy new logins between script runs. This is a spare capacity for new connections. Once the current session and threshold value are added, that number is divided by the depth first max value. This is the total number of sessions allowed per session host. Any fraction is rounded up. That equals the total number of session hosts that should be running. The script will shut down and start servers based on that number. For example, let's say we have 3 session hosts with 3 users logged in. The threshold value is 2 and the max session per host is 5. The script runs and calculates 3 sessions plus the 2 session threshold equals 5, divided by the max sessions of 5, and we get 1. In this instance, 1 server should be running. In this example, if all the servers happen to be running, the script would shut down 2 of them. The script will not shut down session hosts with active connections. So in this example, if 2 users were logged into the first server and 1 into the second, only the third would be shut down. This is a good time to mention that you should put a policy in place that forces logouts of disconnected and idle sessions. That way, idle and disconnected sessions won't prevent VMs from stopping. I go over setting this GPO up in the demo. Let's get back to that example. We have 3 session hosts, 3 users logged into the first with a 2 session threshold and 5 connection max per host. The other servers are powered off. 1 additional user logs in. Now there's only 1 available session. The next time the script runs, it will calculate 4 active sessions. The 2 session threshold equals 6. With a 5 session max, 6 divided by 5 equals 1.2. That gets rounded to the next whole number. The next run of the script, we'll see 1 server is running, but 2 should be, and we'll start the second server. A couple more things before we move on to the demo. You may want to be more aggressive on the number of available sessions during certain times of the day. For example, maybe the rate of logins is higher between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays. You may want to set a threshold value higher during these times. The script has a peak time option where you can specify the peak threshold value and a time range for that value. Say, in the previous example, you want to change the threshold to 4 during peak hours. The same logic applies, only modifying that threshold value during the specified time range. If you want to keep an extra server running at all times, setting the threshold to the max setting +1 would accomplish that. Also, any session host set with drain mode on will not accept new connections. These servers are ignored when the script runs. In addition, they may be under some type of maintenance and should not be automatically shut down. Any servers in drain mode are not started or stopped with this script. Enough with the PowerPoint, let's move on and set this up. We're going to walk through the following. Setting up the GPO to log users off, creating the function app, create a managed identity from the function app, and give it rights to start and stop servers, create the function and add and update the code, modify the function app. This includes disabling the function app, enabling verbose logging, and changing the run interval. And of course, we test along the way. Here we are on a domain controller. Let's start with a group policy object that will auto log off disconnected and idle sessions. So I've already got a group policy, but you can create one, give it a name, whatever you need. I'm going to go into edit this, and I'll just walk through the settings. And let me just move this around a little bit, make sure it fits. Let's go to Policies under Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Remote Desktop Services, Remote Desktop Session Host, and Session Time Limits. Here you can see I only have one set, but there's others you can add as well. If you just go in and edit, you can see I have this set to end disconnected sessions after 5 minutes. That may be a little bit aggressive for some environments. You can go through and check each of these, and that's set up to whatever your environment supports. And the idea with this is you don't want to have idle and disconnected sessions hanging out for too long, because that will prevent the script from shutting down those session hosts. The script will only shut down session hosts without any sessions. So modify those settings as needed, save and apply it to the OU your session hosts are in. Now that that's in place, let's create the function app. So I'm going to go to create a resource from the Azure portal and type in function app. I'll select function app and create. For this example, I'll create a new resource group to put it in. You can use an existing if you'd like. I'll give the function app a name. I'll leave the publish as code. The runtime stack will be PowerShell, PowerShell core. Version 6, that's the only version available. And set the region for whatever region you want. Mine will be Central US. I'll click Next to go to hosting. I'll leave the storage account as default. And I'll set the plan type as consumption. If you have a premium or app service running PowerShell, you can use those instead of creating a new function app. But for this, I'm going to use the serverless consumption-based plan. Next, I'll go to monitoring. Leave application insights enabled. If you have application insights in place, you can select that from the list. Otherwise, create new. And I'll leave it as create new. I'm going to go to, let's see, next. You can add tags if you'd like, and then review and create. And I'll create. So we'll give this a few minutes to finish, and I'll be back once it's done. The deployment finished. You can either go to the resource, or if you want to find the resources, you can come here to All Services, type in Function App. And then if you hover over Function App and make sure that star is selected, it will show up on the left here under your menu. I'll just go to my Function Apps, and I'll go to the one we just created. Now that we have the Function App created, the next step is to create the managed identity. The managed identities provide an identity for the function app to use to interact with a session host. It's a special identity with a lifecycle that matches the function app. So if this function app goes away, so will that managed identity. That way you don't have separate identities and applications floating around. In the previous version, I used the Run As account in Azure Automation. This managed identity replaces that functionality. It gives the function app an Azure AD identity that we can then assign to a resource group. So let's do that. We're going to come into under Settings for the function app, Identity. A system assigned managed identity has the same life cycle as the application. That's the one we want. I'm going to turn it on and save. And here it's going to give us the name of the Azure AD identity that we'll use to assign role-based access control to the resource group. So that finished. If we go into role assignments, you can see it's blank. Next, let's go to the resource group the session host VMs are in. Here are the 3 session hosts. So I'm just going to come up and go to access control and add a role assignment. I'm going to use contributor. You can create your own role if you want to give more restrictive permissions, but for this, contributor will give it rights to start and stop VMs. I'll search for that managed identity we created. There it is. Click Save. And now the role assignment has been added. So let's go back to Function Apps. I'll select the function app we created and go back to Identities. Now if we select Role Assignments, you can see this managed identity has contributor rights to that resource group. So good, that's in place. Next, let's go to Functions to create the function. Add. And select Timer Trigger. I'll leave it as the default name. You can change it if you'd like. And then here's the schedule. So by default, it's set to every 5 minutes. This is a cron expression that indicates this will run every 5 minutes. You can change that if you'd like, and I'll show you shortly how to find more information on cron expressions. This is set for 5 minutes, and I'm going to leave it to 5 minutes. You can change it if you'd like. Do be careful not to set it too frequently. It takes a couple minutes from the time a session host is turned on to when it shows available in the host pool. If this runs too frequently, it may not take into consideration the newly started session host and start another one. So I'll leave this to 5 minutes and create the function. Next, I'll go to code test. And this run.ps1, this is where we're going to add the code to run. The first thing I'll do is remove everything under param timer here. I'll leave line 1 and 2 in place. This is needed for the function app to run. It's just pulling in the timer parameter. I don't use that during the script, so you can just leave it as is. Next, I'm going to get the code. There are a couple ways to get the code. I'm just going to go straight to my GitHub page, and I'll include a link to this below. I'll pull up the code and go to raw, and then do a Control-A and copy it. Viewing it raw just makes it easier to copy the code. And I'll come back to the function app and paste it in. We can walk through the code. I've got some comments. I've got a variable here for verbose preference. It's set to continue. You can change it to silently continue. That will suppress any verbose output. If you do want to see the verbose output, you have to set continue here, and we also have to make a change on the function app itself, and I'll do that here coming up shortly. Let's keep walking through the variables. We've got the server start threshold, that's 2. That means there should always be 2 sessions available minimum in between runs. Here's the peak time threshold, so you can set yes if you want to use peak time, no if you don't. The server start threshold for peak time, you can see that's double of what I have it for normal time. So it's a little bit more aggressive. The start time and the end peak time. The time zone, you can use the get time zone command to get your local time zone, or use list available to get the name of all of them. But that does have to be in the ID format of the get time zone. And then the peak days. Next, we have the host pool name. This is the name of my host pool. And then we have the host pool resource group. So that's a resource group the host pool is in. And then the session host VM resource group. It is possible to have session host VMs in a different resource group from the host pool. It's not very common. You have to kind of intentionally do it. But if that is set up that way, you can sort them out here. Most common, they're in the same resource group, so just update it in both locations. There's a function section. Let's go on past that, and we'll just walk through what the code does. So under execution, it gets the host pool. Then it verifies the load balancing type. If it doesn't match depth first, the code will exit. It does have to be depth first, as I mentioned previously. Here's the use peak time. It's going to see if you have it enabled. If you do, it's going to calculate the current time, taking the time zone in consideration. And then compare that between the start and stop times and the day of the week. And if they match, it's going to update the server start threshold with that peak server start threshold. And as we move on, the script figures out the max sessions. It finds the number of available hosts. And do notice way off to the side here, it only pulls session hosts where the allow sessions equals true. So that ignores anything in drain mode. And then it gets the number of current sessions in the pool. Next, it finds the running session host, and then it finds the count of running session hosts. Here, the session host target is the current sessions plus the server start threshold divided by the max sessions. Any fraction is rounded up with the math function. Now that it has the number of running session hosts and the number of session hosts that should be running, it does a comparison. If the running session host is less than the target, it's going to run the start session host function. If the running session host count is greater than the target, it's going to run the stop session host function. And then if they're equal, the script terminates. So let's go up to the functions. We'll just go over that real quick. So the start session host function just takes the session host and the number of hosts that it should start, and it goes through. The one thing I want to point out here is this error. It indicates the threshold has been met to start a new session host, but none are available. That indicates that you're getting full and you may run out of capacity. So that may be something to monitor, and if you get this error, it may indicate that you need to add more session hosts. And then it'll go through and start the session host. Stop is similar. It grabs all the session host information and the host to stop, and it'll go through and find an empty host count. And again, this empty host count is going to find session host with no users logged in. If it can't find any session host with no connection, you'll write an error that indicates that. Otherwise, it'll go through and stop the session host. Now that that's in place, I'm going to save. Before I move on, I'm going to make one more change. I'm going to come back to Overview. I'm going to disable this. So what this does is it prevents this script from running on its normal schedule. I can still run it manually, but the schedule won't function. I'm doing this just in the test because I want to control when it runs. Otherwise, if I leave it enabled, it will run every 5 minutes. So now I'll go back to my code and test. I'm going to hop over to another window I have here that shows the session hosts. And you can see they're all stopped. So they're all stopped. There's no users logged in. My threshold is 2, so if I run this, it should start servers. Go to Test Run and click Run. And that will start the function. I'll just close this. And in a few seconds, we should see some information scroll across the bottom. So the script ran, and let's go back to virtual machines, and we can see one is started. So that's great. That's exactly what it should have done. Now, if we want to look at the logs, we have to go into Monitor. And it could take up to 5 minutes for the job to show up under Monitor. These are a couple older jobs that I did, so I'm going to wait for the new one to come through, and we'll review the log. Here it is, and that did take a few minutes to show up, but this is the new log, and we can see we have some information coming through, some outputs, other information, a lot of information, and then more outputs. So I don't have any of that verbose information, and that's what I really look for because that indicates what the script's doing. In order to view the verbose information, we have to go back to the function app and go to app files. And under the host.json file, we have to add in the trace level. I'll include what I'm putting in here in my blog, so check the link below to get this information. I'm going to put a comma in and then paste some code in, take out the white space. So this is just setting the logging level to trace. Now I'll click Save. When I save this file, I do have to restart the function app. So I'll go to the function app overview and restart. And after restarting, it does take a minute or so to get the function back online. So I'm going to go to Functions and select the time trigger. And before I go any further, I'm going to come back to my other tab and go into Windows Virtual Desktop. Go into Host Pools. Select the host pool we're working with, Session Host. And here you can see I have one available, that's the one that was just started, and I logged in to 2 sessions on that. And then I have 2 that are unavailable because they're shut down. So this has, let's see, we go to Properties. We can see it has a max session limit of 3. And the threshold is set to 2. So we come back here. So this server only has 1 more session, so the script should turn on another host pool. So let's come back and we'll run that again. I'll click Run, close, and give it a minute to finish. Let's hit refresh and see if it's changed. Good. So now it started a second session host. We can see it's available. And if we come back to our code page, go to Monitor, we should be able to see that verbose information. And if you go through, kind of weed through the information, here it is. So here it's indicating the host pool we're working with, the time, the day, the max sessions. Everything that's set to output to Verbose is showing up in here. It knew there are 2 current sessions and 1 session host. And in the end, it turned on a second session host. Okay, so that worked as expected. Let's try logging off one of these users and running it again. I logged off one user, and now it only has 1 active session. The threshold is 2, and each session host has 3 max. So it should only need 1 right now. Let's go back and run that function again. Looks like it finished. Let's go back to the session host, do a refresh. You can see it still shows it's available, but if I go to the virtual machines, only the first one is showing as running. We'll go back to the host pool. Now under session host, only 1 session host is showing as available with 1 active session. And that is exactly what is expected. So that all seems to be working okay. Next, I want to show one other thing. As I mentioned before, you can modify how frequently this runs. To do that, go into the functions.json file. And actually, before we do that, I'm going to go to the readme.md. In readme.md, under how it works, for time triggers, you have to provide a schedule as a cron expression, and there's a link to a wiki page on how to set cron expressions. Now I'm going to go back to function.json, and you can see here's where you can change that. That covers it. We created the GPO to log users off. We created the function app. We created a managed identity for that function app and then gave it rights to the resource group. We created the function and added the code. We made some changes to the function app, and we also went over how to change the run interval. We ran some tests, and it started and stopped session host as expected. And one last reminder, when you're ready for production, make sure to put this into enable. That will keep it running on the schedule you provided. I hope you find this script useful, and maybe even it saves you some money. Please be sure to test before running in production. If you do use it, I'd love to hear about it. Let the world know and tag me on Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe and do all that good stuff. Thanks for watching.